The final hours of December 31st, 1944 were supposed to be just another mission over Germany, but for the crew of a B-17 flying fortress called Little Skipper, it would become one of the most unbelievable survival stories of World War II. High above the freezing clouds, the massive bomber rumbled forward in formation with dozens of other American aircraft. Inside the cockpit sat Second Lieutenant Glenn Rojohn, gripping the controls, while beside him his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant William Leek, carefully watched the instruments. Below them lay northern Germany. Their mission was simple on paper but deadly in reality. Bomb the oil refineries near Hamburg, crippling Germany's fuel supply during the final brutal winter of the war. The sky ahead looked calm at first, just a gray horizon and the faint shape of the coastline. Then suddenly, black explosions ripped open the sky. German flak batteries had locked onto the bomber formation. Violent bursts of shrapnel detonated beneath the aircraft, rocking the B-17 like a toy in a storm. The crew could hear the terrifying metallic thuds as fragments slammed into aluminum skin, and then the worst part began. One by one, bombers ahead of them started falling. The men aboard the Little Skipper watched in horror as B-17 after B-17 was torn apart by anti-aircraft fire while approaching the target. Burning aircraft spiraled downward through the clouds, trailing smoke and debris. Every man in the formation knew something chilling in that moment. If the flak got just a little more accurate, any of them could be next. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever heard a World War II survival story this intense before? The closer the formation moved toward Hamburg, the thicker the wall of explosions became. The sky no longer looked like open air. It looked like a field of black thunderclouds, each one bursting with deadly steel fragments. Inside the Little Skipper, Glenn Rojohn leaned forward slightly, trying to see through the smoke drifting across the formation. Then he spotted it. Through the haze rising from the docks below, a column of dark target smoke appeared, the signal the bombardiers had been waiting for. "That's the marker," someone called over the intercom. That meant only one thing: bomb run. Across the sky, the surviving B-17s of the group began opening their enormous bomb bay doors. Beneath each aircraft, the heavy metal panels folded apart like giant wings, exposing rows of deadly cargo inside. But the Germans knew exactly what this moment meant. Suddenly, the anti-aircraft fire intensified to a level many of the pilots had never seen before. Explosions erupted directly inside the bomber formation. Shrapnel screamed through the air. And then something horrifying happened in the squadron ahead. A B-17 named Fool's Rush In took a direct hit from flak. The blast ripped into the aircraft and sent it violently veering to the right. The crippled bomber drifted out of position, straight toward another B-17 flying beside it called Cramps Tramps. There was no time to avoid it. In a split second, the two massive bombers slammed into each other. The impact tore Cramps Tramps completely in half. Both aircraft began falling toward the earth in a flaming spiral. For a moment, the crew of the Little Skipper believed no one could have survived that collision. But then someone shouted from the navigator's station, "Parachutes!" Rojohn looked closer. 1, 2, 3. Then more appeared. 3, 4. "I see 6 parachutes," he called out. "Navigator, write that down." Against all odds, 6 men had escaped the burning wreckage. If you had been in that bomber formation witnessing this mid-air disaster, do you think you could have kept flying the mission? Tell me what you would have done. The shock of the collision lingered for only a moment. In combat, there was no time to stare. Glenn Rojohn forced himself back into the mission. The target was directly ahead, and the formation had reached the most dangerous moment of the entire flight, the bomb run, when the aircraft had to fly straight and steady, making them perfect targets for German gunners. Rojohn grabbed the radio switch. "Bombardier, stand by," he said calmly, though the sky outside looked like a storm made of fire. At the nose of the Little Skipper, Sergeant James Shirley, the bombardier, lay over the Norden bomb site, carefully lining up the industrial docks of Hamburg through the crosshairs. The bomber trembled as more flak detonated around them. Metal fragments rattled across the fuselage like hail. Then Shirley's voice came through the intercom. "Almost. Hold her steady." For those few seconds, Rojohn had to keep the massive aircraft perfectly level. Any sudden movement could throw off the entire bombing calculation. Another explosion burst dangerously close to their left wing. Still, he held the controls steady. Then the words everyone waited for echoed through the headset. "Bombs away!" Deep inside the belly of the aircraft, the massive bomb racks released their load. Through the open bomb bay doors, a long stream of 500-pound bombs dropped toward the earth, tumbling silently for a moment before disappearing into the clouds below. In the lower belly turret, the gunner watched the deadly cargo fall. "Russo, how's the view down there?" someone asked. A moment later, his voice came back. "Right on target." Far below, explosions began tearing through the German oil facilities. The mission objective had been achieved, but the most dangerous part of the flight was still ahead. Before the bombers could celebrate, something appeared in the distant sky behind them, something moving far faster than anything they had faced before. Have you ever heard about the terrifying speed of the first jet fighters in World War II? Tell me in the comments if you know which aircraft was about to attack them. The bomb run was complete, and the B-17 formation immediately began the planned maneuver to escape the deadly skies over Hamburg. One after another, the heavy bombers started a wide 180-degree turn toward the North Sea, hoping to put distance between themselves and the dense wall of German anti-aircraft guns. For a brief moment, it seemed like the worst might be over. But war rarely grants mercy that easily. As the surviving bombers tried to tighten their defensive box formation, the lookout suddenly shouted over the intercom, "Fighters! Large group approaching fast!" Within seconds, dark shapes appeared in the distance, racing toward the American bombers with terrifying speed. These weren't ordinary fighters. The first attackers were Messerschmitt Me-2 jet fighters, the fastest aircraft in the world at that time. They screamed through the sky like silver arrows, far quicker than the propeller-driven bombers could react. One of the jets streaked above the formation, diving through the B-17s while firing its Mk-108 cannons. Bright flashes erupted as heavy shells tore through the formation. The jet didn't stay long. It blasted past the bombers in seconds, already pulling away before most of the gunners could even track it. Behind them came the second wave. Bf-109 fighters charged directly toward the bombers from the front, guns blazing. At the same time, FW-190s darted in from the sides, weaving between the defensive fire like angry hornets, the air filled with tracers. Machine guns thundered from every turret of the B-17s. To Glenn Rojohn, the sky looked like a deadly web of fire. And then he noticed something troubling. One of the bombers near his position was falling behind. The aircraft was called Faithful Forever. It had already been badly damaged by flak earlier in the mission, and now the German fighters were closing in on it. In moments, the situation for that crew would become desperate. If you had been flying in that formation, watching enemy fighters closing from every direction, do you think you would feel fear or pure focus? I'd like to know your answer. The B-17, Faithful Forever, struggled to keep up with the formation. Its aluminum skin was already scarred by flak, and one of its engines coughed thick smoke as the aircraft lagged behind the others. In bomber combat, falling behind was one of the worst things that could happen. A single B-17 isolated from the formation became an easy target. Inside the little skipper, Glenn Rojohn watched nervously as the wounded bomber drifted farther back. Then the radio crackled. "Faithful Forever is going down." The voice belonged to the aircraft's pilot, Second Lieutenant Leo Ross. German fighters had struck again. Despite the damage, Ross fought to keep his aircraft under control. With incredible determination, he managed to guide the crippled bomber downward, bringing it to about 5,000 feet, flying straight and level just long enough for his crew to escape. One by one, parachutes blossomed beneath the falling aircraft. Against all odds, every crew member managed to jump and survive. Back in the main formation, however, the situation was becoming increasingly chaotic. The attacks from German fighters had scattered the bombers, leaving dangerous gaps where the defensive machine guns could no longer protect one another. The sky suddenly felt much bigger and much more dangerous. Then a shout came from one of the gunners. "Large group at 8 o'clock. Hi!" For a split second, the crew feared another wave of German fighters. But when Rojohn looked closer, he saw something that made his heart leap with relief. Sleek fighters with long noses were diving toward them from the sun. They weren't German. They were American P-51 Mustangs. "Jesus! Thank God!" someone shouted over the intercom. The escort fighters had finally arrived. The German interceptors quickly realized the situation had changed. Instead of pressing the attack, they broke away, turning their aircraft toward easier targets elsewhere in the sky. For the moment, the bombers had been saved. But the relief would not last long, because the most unbelievable part of this story was still waiting ahead. If you had been in that bomber and suddenly saw friendly fighters arrive at the last second, what do you think you would have felt? Relief, excitement, or disbelief? Tell me below. For a few brief minutes, the appearance of the P-51 Mustangs felt like a miracle. The sleek fighters circled the formation, scanning the sky for German aircraft. Their presence alone was often enough to drive enemy interceptors away. But the Mustangs had another responsibility. Many B-17 groups were still deeper over Germany, even closer to danger than Rojohn's formation. After confirming the immediate threat had faded, the escort fighters throttled up and raced ahead to protect those bombers still approaching the target area. And just like that, the little skipper and the few surviving aircraft near it were alone again. Rojohn kept his eyes fixed on the horizon as the formation slowly pushed toward the North Sea, hoping the worst of the battle was behind them. "Stay sharp, boys," someone warned over the intercom. "The Mustangs are moving forward to cover the lead group." The bombers droned on, engines humming steadily. At last, the gray waters of the sea appeared ahead. For the exhausted crew, it felt like a doorway to safety. Once they crossed the coastline, German defenses would grow weaker. But just as they approached the coast northwest of Hamburg, black explosions appeared again. More flak. Even this far from the city, anti-aircraft batteries were waiting for them. Bursts of fire and steel filled the sky once more, forcing the bombers to fly through another deadly curtain. The aircraft shook violently as turbulence and shockwaves rocked the formation. Keeping tight formation in these conditions became almost impossible. One by one, the bombers drifted farther apart. The sky that once held a strong defensive box was now scattered with vulnerable aircraft. And then the words every crew feared echoed through the intercom. "Enemy fighters! 11 o'clock!" Seconds later, another voice followed. "More fighters! 1 o'clock high!" A second wave of German fighters, launched from bases in Bremen and Oldenburg, was racing toward the weakened bombers over the sea. This time, the formation was no longer strong enough to protect itself. And what happened next would push the little skipper into a disaster almost impossible to imagine. Right now, I'm curious. Did you know the skies over Germany could still be this dangerous even after the bombers left the target? Tell me if this part of the story surprised you. The second wave of German fighters descended on the scattered bombers like wolves spotting wounded prey. Over the churning waters of the North Sea, the once solid B-17 formation was now stretched and broken. Violent turbulence tossed the heavy aircraft around, making it nearly impossible for the crews to hold their positions. For the German pilots, it was the perfect opportunity. Bf-109s and FW-190s dived straight into the gaps, firing bursts of machine gun and cannon fire into the vulnerable bombers. Inside the little skipper, Glenn Rojohn fought the controls while trying to keep his aircraft close to the remaining B-17s. But around him, the formation was slowly falling apart. Engines from several bombers began trailing black smoke and leaking oil, and flashes of fire appeared where bullets struck fuel tanks and wings. One by one, holes opened in the defensive wall. Those gaps were exactly what the German fighters were waiting for. Suddenly, a Bf-109 charged directly toward the front of Rojohn's section. Its guns flashed. The fighter unleashed a deadly burst straight at a B-17 flying just ahead of the little skipper, an aircraft called 9 Lives. The bullets tore through the cockpit. Inside that bomber, the two pilots, McNabb and Vaughan, were struck instantly. Both men were killed before they even knew what had happened. But the rest of the crew didn't realize it yet. The engines of the 9 Lives were still running, and the bomber continued flying forward as if nothing had happened. Behind them, Glenn Rojohn noticed something strange. The aircraft that was supposed to be leading his position had suddenly disappeared from view. He grabbed the intercom. "Pilot to crew. Does anyone see McNabb? Where did 9 Lives go?" What Rojohn didn't know was that the pilotless bomber was still ahead of him, drifting slowly upward, its controls locked by the lifeless hands of its dead pilots. And the two aircraft were now on a direct collision course. Imagine being in the sky during a battle like this, surrounded by fire, smoke, and chaos. Do you think you would even notice another plane drifting toward you in time? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Ahead of the formation, something was terribly wrong. With both pilots dead in the cockpit, the B-17 9 Lives continued flying on its own. Engines roaring, controls slightly pulled back by the weight of the lifeless bodies slumped over the yoke. Because of that pressure on the controls, the aircraft had begun to climb gently. From a distance, it looked normal. But to a nearby bomber pilot named Captain Ethan Porter, the situation looked terrifying. From his position in another B-17, he could clearly see what the others could not. The 9 Lives was drifting straight toward the little skipper. The two massive bombers were closing the distance second by second. Porter grabbed his radio in panic. "McNabb! McNabb! Respond!" No answer. The distance between the aircraft kept shrinking. "McNabb! Damn it! Watch out! You're going to collide!" But the warning came too late. At 12:44 p.m., the sky erupted with a violent jolt. Inside the cockpit of the little skipper, Glenn Rojohn and William Leek were suddenly thrown forward as a massive impact shook their aircraft. The controls lurched violently. Leek's knees slammed against the control column. "What the hell was that?" he shouted. Rojohn instinctively grabbed the throttles, trying to steady the aircraft. "Pilot to crew, report. What happened back there?" For a few seconds, the only sound in their headsets was static. Then someone from the upper turret shouted something that made Rojohn's blood run cold. "Sir, you're not going to believe this. Rojohn twisted in his seat and looked back over his shoulder. What he saw was almost impossible to understand. Another B-17 had pierced the belly of their aircraft. The 9 lives had crashed directly into the underside of the little skipper. The 2 bombers were now locked together in midair, tangled in twisted aluminum like 2 giant insects stuck together. William Leek stared in disbelief. "Glenn, we're stuck together like mating dragonflies." And somehow, both planes were still flying. Be honest, if you suddenly discovered another airplane stuck to yours at 15,000 feet, what do you think would go through your mind first? The collision had turned both bombers into a single, twisted machine hanging in the sky. Metal screamed against metal as the 2 B-17 flying fortresses struggled to stay airborne, their 8 engines roaring unevenly while torn aluminum panels flapped violently in the freezing wind. Inside the 9 lives, the situation was even worse. In the cramped ball turret beneath the aircraft, Sergeant Edward Woodall Jr. had been violently shaken during the collision. Sharp fragments of metal had sliced through the turret, leaving him covered in small cuts and debris. Worse still, the impact had knocked out the turret's electrical and hydraulic systems. The rotating sphere was stuck. For a moment, Woodall feared he might be trapped inside. With shaking hands, he reached for the manual crank, a last resort mechanism that allowed the gunner to slowly rotate the turret by hand. He began turning it, slowly, painfully. The heavy mechanism moved. Every rotation felt like it might snap the handle off completely. But finally, inch by inch, the guns lowered into the exit position. Woodall forced open the hatch and crawled back into the fuselage. What he saw inside the aircraft was a nightmare. The interior was twisted with bent metal and shattered equipment. And then he saw something that made his stomach drop. Directly below, the collision had crushed the ball turret of the little skipper against the fuselage of the 9 lives. Inside that turret was Corporal Joe Russo. The metal sphere had been pushed upward and jammed into the wreckage. Russo was trapped. There was no way to free the turret. Woodall watched silently as Russo realized the truth. The gunner slowly made the sign of the cross. Then, through the intercom system still connected between the aircraft, the crew of the little skipper heard his voice. He had begun to pray. Ave Maria, cheia de graça. In that terrifying moment, surrounded by fire, twisted metal, and the endless sky, Russo calmly began reciting his final prayers, and every man on the aircraft could hear it. Take a moment to think about this. If you were in that bomber hearing those final prayers over the intercom, how do you think you would react? Inside the little skipper, the crew listened in silence as Joe Russo's voice echoed through the intercom. Ave Maria, cheia de graça, rogai por nós, pecadores. The words were steady, almost peaceful, despite the nightmare surrounding them. In the cockpit, William Leek felt a heavy knot form in his chest. Hearing the trapped gunner pray while knowing there was nothing anyone could do was almost unbearable. Later, Leek would say that moment was the hardest part of the entire mission. Not the flak, not the fighters, but hearing a man face death with quiet courage. Wanting to give Russo a moment of privacy in his final prayers, Leek slowly removed his helmet and unplugged his intercom. Meanwhile, the situation outside was growing worse. One of the engines on the 9 lives had caught fire and flames were beginning to spread along the wing. The heat was now reaching the fuselage of the little skipper, burning through the thin aluminum skin. The 2 bombers were still locked together, descending, completely out of formation. The altimeter dropped past 15,000 feet. Rojohn and Leek planted their boots against the instrument panel, pulling with all their strength on the controls as they fought to keep the twisted aircraft stable. "Come on! Level out!" Rojohn shouted. Again and again he tried to shake the planes apart, pushing the throttles forward, rocking the controls, trying anything that might separate the 2 machines. Nothing worked. Finally, Rojohn made a decision that would determine whether anyone survived. If they crashed into the freezing waters of the North Sea, every man would die. So he pointed the nose of the tangled aircraft back toward Germany. "Bill, we have to reach land," he said, because only over land would the crew have a chance to jump and survive. And somehow, against all logic, the 2 pilots began attempting the impossible, turning 2 locked bombers in midair. Before the story ends, I'm curious, do you think you would have had the courage to keep flying in that situation, or would fear have taken over? Tell me what you honestly think.